Shalom family, this is your brother Dana, and I'm coming to you from the city of Atlanta, from a place in one love. Those of you who have been following me for a while will recognize the name of Michael Sanders. And those that don't, this here is Michael Sanders. This is a picture of him a year ago, this coming December, when he received a master's degree, high honors, in theology. But he's in prison. In fact, he's been locked up since 1998, where he was tortured for 36 hours, then signed a statement that found him guilty, where he is due to spend the rest of his life in prison. A year ago this October, the 8th to be exact, some of you watching right now helped us raise the money for an attorney, where myself, a few others, and my mother and my father stood before the Illinois Governor Parole Board, demanding that the governor of Illinois would release Mr. Sanders. For there was no evidence. In fact, the evidence that was later found went against the statement he was coerced to sign. And we were pleading for his release. We are still pleading and waiting for his release. What you don't know is, how did I get to know Michael Sanders? So I take you back to when I was walking Morse Avenue. It's where I found the rocks, the tumors in my feet. Well, on one of those days as I was walking home, a gentleman came up from behind me and began to ask my name and made a compliment that I see you out here walking almost every day, and a lot of times you're either in crutches or in a boot. Why do you walk around? And so as we were walking, we were sharing, and we got to the parking lot just before my apartment. And that is where I told this gentleman, who now told me his name, Ronnie, that I was a youth pastor, and I was walking those streets praying for those on the streets and in the neighborhood. And it was at that moment we stood for 5 hours, where Ronnie began to share with me his life. He shared that as a child he was beaten by his mother. And then one day when he was maybe 4 or 5 years old, his mom said to him and his older sister of about 3 years, "Let's go to McDonald's." And on the way to McDonald's, they stopped at the police station because mom said she had to use the washroom. However, mom asked the two to sit here, and she went out another door, abandoning them both. Ronnie shared how home after home and group home, he was abused, not just physically, but also sexually. He shared how he began a drug habit that was affecting him to that very day. Ronnie and I are about the same age, so back then I was probably in my late 20s, middle 20s. He shared that if he could have met somebody that would have cared about him, his life may not be in the position it was. He had 5 daughters, Sherlinda, his wife. And then he shared about a year ago, on Mother's Day, he was left to watch Ronnie Jr. while he slept, and mom ran out to get some necessities. And she came back about an hour later, and little Ronnie was still sleeping. And so big Ronnie and Sherlinda went into the bedroom, and they found little Ronnie cold, had died of SIDS. Ronnie to that day said he's never forgiven himself, nor will he ever forgive himself for allowing his son to die. He shared how that has plummeted him even deeper into addiction. Gave a hug, said goodbye, and exchanged numbers, and he went his way and I went mine. For the next couple of years, I would see and talk to Ronnie on a regular basis. In fact, there was times he would call me to help talk to Sherlinda because they were having a disagreement. And there was times I got to meet his young daughters. And then one day, I saw in the news that they had linked 2 women in the Rogers Park community that were raped and murdered in their apartment. And a few days after that, they had linked it to a gentleman using an ATM card that belonged to the last victim. I remember it was February 14th. And on the 15th, I was on Morse Avenue again, and Ronnie was always dressed very preppy. And this time, I didn't at first see that it was Ronnie, but then I noticed it was Ronnie. He had a hoodie on, and when I said, "Hey, Ronnie, how you doing?" he was nervous. He was fidgety. I figured he was in his addiction. And so about a month later, it came out on the news, a photo of an individual that used the ATM card of this last victim, and that if you would recognize him, please call the authorities immediately. I couldn't see the face. I barely paid any attention to it, and then there was supposed to be another individual way in the background. However, this individual's daughter recognized him, and the next day in school, she told her teacher, the teacher told the administration, and that afternoon, Ronnie, on his way to go and pick up his daughter, stopped by at a job where Michael Sanders, his good friend, was working. And from there, they went to the school to pick up Ronnie's daughter, but were met by a squadron of police officers. It was at that point that Ronnie and Michael Sanders were arrested. It was at that point that Mike spent 36 hours being tortured. It was a day or so after that that the news then released that this individual that had murdered these 2 women, in fact, had murdered one even before. So 3 was Ronald Hinton. They showed his mug shots, and I had to take a couple looks, but I had to embrace the fact that that was Ronnie. And so I went down right away to Cook County Jail. I had never been there before. There's over 15 divisions, and I didn't know where to go, so I went from this place, and they said, "You got to go here," and then I went to there, and then I went to here, and finally I got to Division 8, which is the medical division. Walked in and went through all of the pat-downs and the metal detectors, and gave the name, and they said, "Yes, he's here." I said, "Great." And so I sat, and I sat, and I sat, and I sat. And about 12 hours later, 10 hours, 11 hours later, the superintendent was about to leave her shift. And when she was walking out, she looked over and she saw me there, and she came and she said, "Young man, you have been here all day. What is going on? What can I do to help you?" And I told her I was here for Ronnie, and she's like, "No, this is The day you're supposed to only visit women, but you've been here all day. But in fact, he's not here yet. He's being arraigned in court. But I will see to it that when he returns, you will get a chance to see him. You have been here all day. So a couple hours after that, finally, the guard called my name, and I went into a room, and a few minutes later, in came Ronnie. And it was at that point that Ronnie shared with me that he had done those crimes all on his own. In fact, the last time I saw him was just moments after he had left the apartment of the last young lady. He then asked me to please go and visit his good friend, his best friend from childhood, Michael Sanders. He said, please tell Michael Sanders that I will get him out of this mess. And that is how I got to know Michael Sanders. I went to visit him, Michael Sanders, to relay this message to him. But it took several visits before Mike began to halfway warm up to me. But today, 24 years later, Michael Sanders is actually one of my best friends. We tried to get Mike out, Kent Law School. You know, we proved that it was impossible that for Mike to be involved. There was no DNA. There was no fingerprints. There was, in fact, he had like an alibi. But when the judge doesn't allow certain information into the courtroom, the jury will make their decisions based on the evidence they get to see and hear. Mike was set up to be guilty. How could a judge expose the lies of the police officers and the detectives that said Mike signed a statement on his own? So I began to go and visit Mike every single week. And it was through him that the superintendent one day called me into his office and he said, "Sir, I don't know who you are, but," he says, "all I know is that you have not missed a week for years. You've been up here in boots and you've been up here on crutches, but you've always been up here. And you are somebody that I can trust with my men." And that is where he began to open up the door for me to have full access to Cook County Jail Division 10. It was from there that the Life Learning Dorm with a couple others was created. I'll never forget, my mom and dad were allowed to come in, and this is where my mom and dad met Mike for the first time. And when we pulled up on the street to go into Cook County Jail, it was at that point that my father said, "I ain't going in. I ain't going in there." And my mom said, "I am." So she got out of the car, and then my dad began to get out of the car. And I said, "Well, Dad, I thought you weren't going to go in." "Well, God, somebody's got to protect her when those monsters." We went in behind those bars. An hour and a half later, it was time for us to go. And the officer came over, Officer Carter. And he said, "Look, Dana, you got to get your dad to stop talking. We got to go." I had to drag Dad out of there. And I shared this story almost a year ago when my dad passed away from COVID. And I shared that as we sat in the car and I looked in the rearview mirror, there, I saw tears running down my dad's face. His life was impacted by those inmates in a way that he had changed. In fact, my mom and dad adopted Mike. See, Mike's mom died of cancer several years before he got locked up. And just before that, one of his older brothers, who was really, or uncles, that was one of his like father figures, was sent down to fix a furnace that they knew they shouldn't have sent him down. And there was a mixture of gases, and it literally melted the skin off his body. And so by the time Mike was locked up, he had one relative living, and that was Aunt Mary. Aunt Mary was already in her middle 70s, low 70s. But Aunt Mary, for 5 years I would go to church and pick her up, and she'd go with me, and when I'd drop her off, I'd walk into the house, and Aunt Mary would send me home with at least 4 to 5 days of food. The best soul food I've ever eaten. The last time I saw Aunt Mary was the same time I saw my father, and that was a year ago, October 8th. Aunt Mary, just a few months ago, passed away as well. And last night when Mike called me to check in, he said, "You know, Brother Dana, there's only 2 people I have left in my life. That is you, and that is Mom. Can't talk about my dad too much yet without crying. Because see, my dad had promised him that as soon as he gets out, him with my dad would be going fishing out on a boat. One thing Mike has always wanted to do, but has yet to have that opportunity. And now that Dad had passed, it's broken Mark's heart. But for 22 years, my mom and dad has sent money every month to make sure that Mike can buy toiletries and extra food to make it as comfortable as possible for him while he's locked up. Through my relationship with Mike, the Most High God entered in. Currently in Joliet, the superintendent of that prison has asked Mike to serve and work in hospice, where Mike sits and talks to men who are in their last days of life here on earth after spending the majority of it all locked up, not able to have a family member around them when they take their last breath. Mike says it's one of the hardest things he's ever done, but to be able to be there in a man's last minutes of his life so that he doesn't die alone, Mike said is one of the greatest things he could do. And he always says, I hope that God will return to me also, that in my last breath, I will not die alone. You may be asking about Ronnie. Well, during the trial, I found out a whole lot more about Ronnie, that he walked into several beauty shops, beauty salons, and robbed the women right there by gunpoint. And I also heard the testimony of at least 2 to 3 other men that Ronnie would follow and stir up a conversation with them as they would walk home. And just when he found out exactly their home and which apartment, he would shoot them, or he would pistol whip them or beat them and then rob them. One of the last times I saw Ronnie, I also ran into his mother. And she told me the story that at the age of about 30, Ronnie's father got locked up, was being charged with raping and murdering a woman. And while he was in that cell, he hung himself and committed suicide. I haven't seen Ronnie for years, but this is Ronnie. About 6 years into being locked up, he got into a fight. And he was shanked in his eye. I look at the difference in the lives of those two men. I thank the Most High Yah for the honor he has given me to be able to walk with Mike for almost 24 years. Mike's faith has challenged my faith. That he's never given up. He's never thrown in the towel. And last night when we spoke, I said, remember, Mike, we still got that hope that we will believe that the Most High Yah will set you free. About 2 weeks ago when Mike called me, he shared that the Innocents in the Exoneration Project in Chicago, who we initially reached out to, but it didn't happen, returned to Mike because they're found out that the same officers that tortured Mike have tortured several others. In fact, last month, Mike told me there was 7 of them that were released from prison. And so they have reopened Mike's case. They have taken Mike's case because they too believe he's an innocent man. And they too believe that he is a product of torture. And so, family, I hope and pray that you will pray with us that Michael Sanders will be released. 24 years of spending his life behind bars as an innocent man is way long enough. And so now you know how I met Michael Sanders and how my journey of being at Cook County Jail for 18 years all began. This is your brother coming to you from the city of Atlanta, from a place in one love. Shalom, family.